The workshop that still smelled like work. The auction was nearly over when the old mechanic raised his hand. Most people had already drifted toward the coffee table inside the county administration building, chatting about farmland, tractors, and fence posts. Lot number 17, the abandoned repair workshop along Old Mill Road, had attracted little more than a few amused glances. The roof leaked. The office windows were boarded over. Half the concrete apron had cracked apart from winters nobody had cared to repair. A developer standing near the back had dismissed it with a shrug after learning the highway bypass had diverted almost all traffic years ago. It wasn't worth much. At least, that was what everyone believed. The auctioneer called for another bid, waited, then looked around the room. The retired mechanic lifted one weathered hand. The gesture was small enough that several people almost missed it. Sold. The gavel landed with a dry knock. For a brief second, the mechanic wondered whether he had just bought a building or answered a question he hadn't been able to name since retiring 8 months earlier. By the following Monday morning, he parked his aging pickup outside the workshop just before sunrise. Mist drifted low across the empty fields. The faded sign above the entrance still carried the ghost of lettering where years of sunlight had bleached away the paint. One hinge groaned as he unlocked the heavy steel door. The smell reached him first. Old motor oil, cutting fluid, rust, dry wood. A trace of welding smoke that somehow still lingered after all these years. Most people would have called it stale. To him, it smelled like work. He stood in silence for nearly a minute before taking another step inside. Water dripped steadily through a cracked skylight into a rusted metal bucket. Ping, ping, ping. The sound echoed through the empty building. Rows of forgotten machinery waited beneath thick blankets of dust. An old hydraulic press leaned slightly to one side. Shelves sagged beneath coffee cans filled with bolts sorted decades earlier by someone patient enough to care about thread sizes. Nothing had moved in years, yet the place didn't feel abandoned. It felt interrupted. The distinction stayed with him as he slowly walked the length of the workshop. His boots disturbed a fine layer of dust across most of the concrete floor. Most. Near the center of the building, one narrow strip looked different. The dust there was thinner, not clean, just different. He crouched, rubbing 2 fingers across the concrete. Strange, as if something heavy had once rested there for a very long time before being dragged away, or perhaps moved more recently than anyone realized. There was too much work waiting. For the next several days, his routine became almost automatic. Coffee before dawn, pick up by 6. Workshop before sunrise, sweep, sort, clean, repair. He worked slowly, not because AH forced him to, but because rushing had never solved mechanical problems. Machines rewarded patience. People often didn't. Around mid-morning each day, the owner of the nearby feed store wandered over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "You planning to turn this place into something?" The mechanic smiled faintly. "Haven't decided. You know they're building another storage complex 2 miles east." "So I've heard. Folks say you'll never make money here." The mechanic glanced toward the open workshop door. "I didn't buy it for that." The feed store owner studied him for a moment. He seemed ready to ask another question. Instead, he simply nodded. Some answers weren't ready yet. His daughter called that evening. "How's retirement?" He looked around his quiet kitchen. "Different. And the workshop? It's keeping me busy." She laughed softly. "Dad, that's exactly what worries me." He understood. She remembered the decades of missed birthdays whenever emergency repairs kept him working late. She remembered holidays interrupted by broken combines during harvest season. She wanted retirement to mean rest. He wasn't sure rest had ever suited him. "I'm not overdoing it." "You promise?" "I promise." After they hung up, he noticed grease beneath one thumbnail. He smiled despite himself. Old habits lingered. By the end of the week, sunlight finally reached parts of the workshop floor hidden beneath years of accumulated clutter. As he dismantled a line of warped wooden shelving along the back wall, something unusual caught his attention. The shelving wasn't attached directly to the bricks. There was space behind it, not much, just enough to seem intentional. He removed another section, then another. Behind the final shelf stood a narrow partition constructed from plywood that had darkened with age. No obvious handle, no latch, only 4 carefully driven screws. He removed them one by one. The panel shifted inward. Behind it rested a heavy steel engine stand unlike any he had seen before. Not because it was expensive, quite the opposite. It had been built by hand. Every weld was deliberate, every adjustment point precisely machined. Its rotating head locked into angles commercial stands never offered. He circled it slowly. Whoever built this hadn't copied someone else's design. They had solved problems through experience. He ran his fingertips across smooth weld beads. No unnecessary material, no decorative flourishes. Everything served a purpose. It had to be earned. For reasons he couldn't explain, uncovering the stand felt less like finding forgotten equipment and more like meeting the person who had built it. Rain arrived that afternoon. Heavy drops hammered against the roof, while thunder rolled across distant fields. Inside, the workshop remained dim except for a single work lamp illuminating the engine stand. The mechanic spent nearly an hour studying it, not taking measurements, simply looking, trying to understand the thinking behind every decision. Good mechanics eventually learned to recognize another craftsman's habits. Some preferred strength over elegance, others chased precision. This builder had pursued something rarer, efficiency. Nothing existed unless it absolutely needed to. He respected that. Perhaps because he'd spent most of his own career working the same way. Outside, rainwater streamed across broken concrete toward the roadside ditch. Inside, time seemed strangely suspended. The building no longer felt empty. It felt patient, as though it had been waiting for someone who could recognize what had been left behind. Late in the afternoon, while searching for matching hardware that might fit the engine stand, he opened a dented steel toolbox tucked beneath an old workbench. Most drawers contained exactly what he expected: drill bits, calipers, micrometers, files worn smooth from decades of careful hands. The bottom drawer resisted. He tugged harder. It slid open with a metallic scrape. Inside lay a weathered notebook wrapped in faded canvas. He brushed away the dust and untied the cord. The first pages contained tearful engineering sketches, not artistic drawings, working drawings, dimensions, load calculations, stress diagrams, mechanical notes written in neat block lettering. He turned another page, then another. Each design became more ambitious than the last. Whoever owned this notebook wasn't merely repairing equipment. They were inventing better ways to build it. Then, almost without warning, the entries stopped. The final drawing covered only half a page. A complex lifting mechanism, several measurements, one unfinished equation trailing off into blank paper. No signature, no explanation, no final entry, just empty pages. The mechanic closed the notebook and looked across the workshop toward the handcrafted engine stand, standing quietly beneath the hanging work light. For the first time since buying the property, he realized he hadn't purchased an abandoned workshop at all. He had stepped into the middle of someone else's unfinished work. And somewhere between the silent machinery and the half-finished sketches, one question refused to leave him. Why had someone hidden all of this, instead of finishing it? The first repair arrived on a Wednesday. It came on the back of a dented flatbed trailer pulled by a farmer named Eli Mercer, whose hay baler had stopped working in the middle of second cutting. Eli climbed out, removed his cap, and looked around the half-restored workshop. "Heard somebody bought the old place," he said. The mechanic wiped his hands on a rag. "That'd be me. You still work on hydraulics?" "Depends what's wrong with it." Eli gave a tired laugh. "If I knew that, I wouldn't be here." The mechanic knelt beside the baler, tracing a finger along a cracked hydraulic line hidden behind a shield plate. "When did it start leaking?" "Yesterday." "No," the mechanic said quietly. "Yesterday is when it became visible." Eli looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Farmers understood the difference. By noon, the baler was running again. Eli tried to pay him. The mechanic accepted enough to cover parts and fuel, then waved away the rest. "Come back if it leaks again." "You sure?" "I'm sure." Eli drove away looking faintly puzzled, as if he'd stumbled into a business that operated by rules nobody used anymore. 2 days later, another truck appeared. Then a tractor. Then an irrigation pump that a dealership had declared uneconomical to repair. The mechanic never advertised. He didn't put up a sign or post anything online. He simply left the workshop door open while he worked. People noticed. By the end of the month, there was usually one vehicle waiting outside by mid-morning. One hot afternoon, a woman in her early 30s walked in, carrying a stack of folders under one arm. She introduced herself as Lena Ortiz, instructor for the vocational program at the County Technical School. "I've been hearing about this place from my students," she said. "That good or bad?" "Depends who you ask." She smiled. "Mind if I look around?" He shrugged. "Nothing here is hidden." That wasn't entirely true, of course. The notebook stayed in the bottom drawer of his workbench, though he wasn't sure why he kept it there instead of taking it home. Lena wandered slowly through the shop, studying the old equipment with the attention of someone who actually understood what she was seeing. When she reached the handcrafted engine stand, she stopped. "Who built this?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." She ran a hand along one of the adjustment collars. "This is clever." "How so?" "Look at the load path." She pointed to a series of angled braces. Most commercial stands transfer stress through the center pivot. This one distributes it across the frame. The mechanic glanced at her, surprised. "You teach this stuff?" "I try." He hesitated, then retrieved the notebook. Lena opened it casually. 3 pages later, her expression changed. "Where did you get this?" "Found it here." She turned another page, then another, reading silently. "These calculations," she murmured. "Whoever wrote them understood load balancing at a level most of my textbooks barely cover. Can you tell what they were building?" "Not yet." She tapped the unfinished drawing near the back. But this wasn't hobby work. For the first time, the mechanic felt a faint uneasiness beneath his curiosity. What kind of person had been working here? That question followed him for weeks. He began asking older customers whether they remembered the workshop before it closed. The answers came slowly. "Old fellow named Walter Green ran it. Best fabricator around. Could fix things nobody else would touch. Charged too little. Worked nights. Kept strange hours. Died before he finished some project he was obsessed with." One retired truck driver remembered more. "Walter wasn't chasing money," the driver said. "He was trying to make certain repair jobs safer." Said he was tired of hearing about mechanics getting crushed under equipment because they had to improvise lifting setups. That night, the mechanic reopened a notebook and studied the unfinished drawing for nearly 3 hours. He started seeing patterns he had missed before. The mechanism wasn't designed to lift engines faster. It was designed to hold heavy equipment more securely while people worked underneath it. Safer, more stable, less dependent on luck. Then the developer arrived. His name was Martin Hale, and he wore polished boots that somehow never collected dust. "I'll be direct," he said, looking around the workshop. "I'm assembling property along this corridor. Storage units, contractor bays, that sort of thing." "Congratulations." Hale smiled politely. "I understand you bought this place for very little. I'm prepared to offer substantially more." The number he named was enough to make the mechanic pause. It would pay off his truck, help his daughter, leave a comfortable cushion for retirement. Hale seemed to notice the hesitation. "You've done admirable work cleaning it up," he said. "But let's be honest, this highway's never coming back." The mechanic looked through the open bay door. A teenager was helping his grandfather unload a broken mower. 2 farmers stood beside a pickup discussing irrigation pumps. Inside, Lena was showing one of her students how to read a micrometer. The building suddenly felt less empty than it had in decades. "I'll think about it," he said. Hale handed him a business card. "Don't take too long." That evening, a thunderstorm rolled across the valley. Rain hammered the roof, while the mechanic sat alone at the workbench with the notebook open under a single lamp. He compared the unfinished drawing to the hidden engine stand. One detail kept bothering him. The dimensions didn't match, at least not directly. He grabbed a tape measure, measured the stand, measured again. Then he stopped. His pulse quickened slightly. The stand wasn't the final invention. It was a component, a foundation, a precisely engineered support structure designed to connect to something larger, something missing. He spread the notebook pages across the bench, tracing lines with grease-stained fingers. For weeks he had assumed Walter Green died before completing the design. Now he wasn't so sure. What if the real problem wasn't that the invention had been unfinished? What if part of it had simply disappeared? Lightning flashed through the skylights. The workshop briefly glowed white. In that instant, the mechanic noticed a faint outline on the concrete floor. The same narrow strip where the dust had been thinner on his first day. Not random marks. Wheel tracks. Heavy wheel tracks leading from the hidden compartment toward a set of old double doors at the rear of the building, as if something substantial had once been rolled out of the shop or removed from it. He looked toward the darkened back doors while rain rattled against the roof. For the first time since buying the workshop, he felt a quiet certainty settle in. Walter Green had finished more than anyone realized. And somewhere beyond those doors, a missing piece of the story was still waiting. Chapter 3: The Last Thing Worth Building. The rain had passed by morning, leaving the fields washed clean and the air carrying that unmistakable scent of wet earth and cut hay. The mechanic stood behind the workshop, coffee cooling in his hand, staring at the faded double doors that hadn't been opened in years. The wheel marks he had noticed the night before disappeared beneath them. He set the mug on an old oil drum and wrapped both hands around the rusted latch. It refused to move. He leaned harder. The hinges groaned in protest before finally giving way with a long, reluctant scrape that echoed through the empty yard. Sunlight poured into a narrow storage shed attached to the back of the workshop. At first glance, it seemed almost empty. Broken shelving, rotting pallets, a stack of rusted steel pipe. Then he noticed something beneath a torn canvas tarp. 4 heavy steel wheels. He pulled the tarp aside. It wasn't a machine. It was a welded steel frame nearly 7 feet long, built with the same deliberate craftsmanship as the hidden engine stand. Dust covered every surface, but the joints were clean, the welds flawless. Several mounting points matched the notebook's unfinished drawings almost perfectly. He ran his hand across the frame. So, this is where you went. For the next week, he closed the workshop to customers after lunch. Not because he wanted privacy, but because whatever Walter Green had built deserved patience. He rolled the steel frame inside using a chain hoist and carefully positioned it beside the handcrafted engine stand. The 2 pieces fit together almost naturally. Not perfectly. There were still missing brackets, unfinished pivots, and several machined bushings that had never been installed. But the design finally made sense. Walter hadn't been building another engine stand. He had designed a modular lifting system that could safely support heavy farm equipment while mechanics worked underneath. Simple, strong, repairable. No complicated electronics, no proprietary parts. Just intelligent engineering that any skilled fabricator could maintain. The kind of invention that rarely made headlines, but quietly saved lives. One afternoon, Lena stopped by carrying sandwiches. She found the mechanic sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the partially assembled frame. "You've barely touched your lunch." "I've been thinking." "Dangerous habit." He smiled. "I keep wondering why Walter hid all this." She studied the steel frame. "Maybe he didn't." "What do you mean? What if he was protecting it?" He looked up. She continued carefully. "If he knew he was running out of time, maybe hiding it was the safest way to make sure someone who understood it would eventually find it." The workshop fell quiet, except for the ticking of cooling metal. It wasn't proof. The prototype took nearly 2 months. Some components had to be fabricated from scratch. Others came from forgotten bins scattered throughout the workshop. Several times the mechanic rebuilt parts he'd already finished because they weren't quite right. Lena often stayed after school to help compare measurements against the notebook. Her students occasionally stopped by as well. At first, they mostly watched. Then, they started asking questions. Eventually, the mechanic handed one young apprentice a micrometer. "Measure this shaft." The teenager looked nervous. "What if I get it wrong?" "You probably will." The young man blinked. The mechanic smiled. "So did I." It became an unspoken tradition. Every mistake turned into a lesson. Every lesson into confidence. Without realizing it, the mechanic had begun teaching. Meanwhile, Martin Hale returned with another offer. This one was considerably larger. "I've seen more vehicles here lately," Hale observed. "People need repairs. They'll find somewhere else." The mechanic folded the written offer and slipped it back across the workbench. "I appreciate it. You didn't even read the number." "I don't need to." Hale looked around the shop. "You really believe this old place has a future?" The mechanic glanced toward a group of students learning to weld beneath Lena's supervision. "I think it already does." For the first time, Hale didn't argue. He simply nodded once, almost respectfully, before walking back to his truck. Not every disagreement needed a winner. Autumn arrived quietly. The maples along Old Mill Road turned deep shades of amber and crimson. On a crisp Saturday morning, the county vocational school hosted its annual trades exhibition. Lena insisted they bring Walter's completed lifting system. The mechanic wasn't convinced. "It isn't finished." She smiled. It works. There's a difference. There always will be. After a long pause, he finally agreed. The demonstration drew only a modest crowd, mostly mechanics, farmers, equipment operators, people whose livelihoods depended on heavy machinery. No television cameras, no reporters, no investors. Exactly the kind of audience Walter probably would have wanted. The mechanic demonstrated how the system stabilized large engine assemblies using adjustable support points instead of improvised blocking. He explained nothing dramatically. He simply showed each step. Questions came naturally. Could it support tractor transmissions? Yes. Would replacement parts require special ordering? No. Could local fabrication shops build their own versions? Absolutely. That answer surprised several people. One man finally asked the obvious question, "Aren't you planning to patent it?" The mechanic looked at the steel frame, then at the notebook resting quietly on the table beside it. No, why not? Because farmers shouldn't have to pay royalties to stay alive. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Then someone quietly nodded. Soon another did the same. Months passed. Copies of the design began appearing in neighboring counties. Some fabricators modified it slightly. Others improved certain brackets. One agricultural cooperative adapted it for larger combines. Walter Green's original idea continued evolving, not because one person owned it, but because many people contributed to it. The mechanic never tried to stop them. In fact, he welcomed every improvement. Machines, like knowledge, became better when shared. Winter settled over the valley. Snow gathered along the edges of the workshop roof, while warm light spilled through newly repaired windows. The building had changed. Fresh paint covered the walls. Organized tool cabinets replaced broken shelving. The old hydraulic press stood straight again. But the greatest difference couldn't be measured. The workshop was no longer quiet. It breathed. Students stopped by after school. Retired tradesmen came for coffee on Saturday mornings. Farmers exchanged repair ideas while waiting for parts. Nobody seemed in a hurry to leave. One January morning, the mechanic arrived before sunrise, as he always had. He carried the same dented thermos, parked in the same spot, walked the familiar path to the front door. Then he noticed something unusual. Light glowed beneath the bay door. He frowned. Had someone forgotten to lock up? When he stepped inside, he found 3 apprentices already at work. One was explaining bearing tolerances to another, while a third prepared steel stock for machining. Near the welding booth, Weena reviewed blueprints with a local farmer. No one noticed him immediately. They were too busy. He stood quietly just inside the entrance, listening. The chain hoist rolled smoothly across its track. A grinder sparked briefly in the corner. Someone laughed after dropping a socket. Coffee brewed somewhere in the office. The workshop sounded alive, not because of the machines, because of the people. The mechanic removed his jacket and hung it on the same old hook beside the door. He picked up a push broom leaning against the wall and began sweeping the concrete floor with slow, familiar strokes. One apprentice finally looked over. "Morning. Morning. You don't have to do that, you know." The mechanic smiled without stopping. "I know." He continued sweeping, watching the first rays of sunlight filter through the repaired skylights, illuminating benches crowded with people solving problems together. Months earlier, he had believed he was buying an abandoned building. Instead, he had inherited a promise. Not Walter Green's invention, not the workshop itself, something far more valuable. The belief that honest work, freely shared, could outlast the hands that first created it. Outside, traffic rolled quietly along the old county road. Inside, the workshop no one wanted had become the place no one wanted to leave. And for the first time since retiring, the mechanic no longer wondered who he was without a job. He had simply found another way to keep repairing things. Only now, it wasn't just Mac.